April 23, 1946, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The transport ship SS Marine Eagle sat anchored in the Mississippi River, visible from the camp's western fence line. Obergefreiter Hans Wolf stood gripping the chain-link barrier, watching the first groups of German prisoners board trucks for New Orleans. Tears streamed down his face. His hands trembled. When the camp chaplain approached to offer comfort, Wolf turned with eyes that held something beyond sadness, something closer to terror. "We're going back to hell," he said in carefully practiced English. "You're sending us back to hell." The chaplain, Captain Robert Morrison, had served at Camp Ruston for 18 months. He had overseen the arrival of thousands of German prisoners, witnessed their transformation from defeated enemies to men who smiled, who gained weight, who learned trades. He had never seen one cry at the prospect of going home. Until today. By evening, Morrison would file a report that would reach the War Department within 48 hours. Subject, prisoner morale during repatriation operations. The report's first line read, "Emotional distress among returnees exceeds anything observed during combat stress counseling. Multiple prisoners have requested permission to remain in the United States. Several have wept openly. One attempted self-harm to avoid transport." Between April 1946 and July 1947, the United States repatriated 371,683 German prisoners of war. Military authorities had anticipated relief, even celebration. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented in military history: mass psychological collapse among men being sent home to freedom. The German prisoners weren't returning to the Germany they remembered. They were returning to a wasteland of starvation, destruction, and Soviet occupation that made their captivity in America seem like paradise lost. The contrast had been building for months. Throughout 1945, as Germany collapsed, prisoners in American camps received letters that painted an increasingly apocalyptic picture. Feldwebel Ernst Müller, held at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, received a letter from his wife in Hamburg, dated February 17, 1945. The camp censor's copy survived in military archives. "Dearest Ernst, I write this by candlelight, as we have no electricity since November. The children and I eat once daily when we can find food. Yesterday, we had potato peel soup. Today, nothing. The bombing last week destroyed our street. We live in the cellar now. Frau Hoffmann's children died of hunger. Please do not worry. We survive. But Ernst, if they offer you food, eat it. Do not save rations for us. We cannot imagine when you might return or what you will return to. Your Maria." Müller had read this letter in the camp mess hall while eating a dinner of pot roast, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, apple pie, and coffee with real cream. He later told the camp psychologist that he vomited immediately afterward. The guilt, he explained, was physically unbearable. Such letters multiplied throughout 1945. By war's end, German prisoners in America were receiving detailed accounts of conditions that defied their comprehension. Cities reduced to rubble, civilian rations at 1,200 calories daily when available, children dying of starvation in the thousands, mass displacement as millions fled the Soviet advance, the complete collapse of civil infrastructure. Meanwhile, in American camps, prisoners lived in conditions most German civilians hadn't experienced since before the First World War. Camp Gordon, Georgia, typical of larger facilities, provided heated barracks with individual beds and clean mattresses, 3 substantial meals daily exceeding 3,000 calories, medical care including dental work and eyeglasses, recreational facilities with sports equipment, educational programs with university correspondence courses, camp canteens selling Coca-Cola, candy, cigarettes and toiletries, and wages of 80 cents daily for work details. The psychological dissonance created by this contrast became acute in late 1945 as news of Germany's devastation reached the camps through Red Cross reports, letters from home, and increasingly American newspapers that prisoners could now read freely. The re-education program that had sought to teach prisoners about democracy inadvertently taught them how thoroughly their homeland had been destroyed. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, captured in North Africa in 1943 and held at Camp Hearn, Texas, kept a secret diary throughout his captivity. The entries from November 1945 onward revealed a man confronting an impossible choice. November 12th. Letter from father. Berlin is gone. Not damaged, gone. He describes streets that no longer exist, buildings that are rubble, people living in cellars like animals. He has lost 40 pounds. Mother died in October. He does not say how. I ate 3 meals today. I gained weight as my family starved. What kind of son am I? December 4th. The American guards showed us photographs from Life magazine. Germany looks like the surface of the moon, cratered, dead, empty. The guard asked if I recognized anything. I recognized nothing. It's not Germany anymore. It's something else. A graveyard pretending to be a country. January 16th, 1946. Official announcement. Repatriation begins soon. The men are terrified. Schmidt tried to hang himself last night. They saved him. He screamed that he didn't want to go back. I understand. We all understand. Here we are prisoners, but we live. There we will be free, but we will starve. The mass psychology of dread that gripped German prisoners as repatriation approached shocked American authorities who expected relief at homecoming. Major Paul Newland of the Prisoner of War. Special Projects Division documented the phenomenon in a classified report, dated March 1946. Prisoners exhibit symptoms consistent with combat stress reaction, he wrote. Insomnia, loss of appetite, emotional outbursts, and in extreme cases, self-harm attempts. The cause is not captivity trauma, but anticipation of return to Germany. They fear freedom more than imprisonment. This represents a complete inversion of expected psychological response. The prisoners' fears were entirely rational. By early 1946, conditions in occupied Germany had reached catastrophic levels. The official civilian ration in the American and British zones provided 900 to 1,300 calories daily, starvation level by any medical standard. In the Soviet zone, rations dropped to 700 calories. The winter of 1945 to 1946, the coldest in 50 years, killed an estimated hundreds of thousands through starvation and exposure. German cities had been systematically destroyed. Hamburg, 75% destroyed. Berlin, 70%. Cologne, 90% of the city center. Dresden, essentially erased. 15 million Germans had been displaced, expelled from eastern territories or fleeing Soviet occupation. They lived in refugee camps, ruined buildings, or simply outdoors. The infrastructure for survival had ceased to exist. Medical care had collapsed completely. Hospitals lacked medicine, anesthesia, surgical equipment, even bandages. Doctors performed amputations without pain relief. Typhus and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Infant mortality in some areas reached 50%. The strong suffered, the weak died. Against this reality, life in American prison camps appeared paradisiacal. Prisoners ate better than they had as soldiers. They received medical care superior to what German civilians could access. They lived in heated buildings with running water and electricity. They earned wages that, while nominal in America, represented wealth in the German black market economy. Some prisoners began calculating ways to delay return. Gefreiter Wilhelm Koch at Camp McCain, Mississippi, deliberately failed his repatriation physical examination by claiming symptoms of tuberculosis. Medical staff, suspicious of the sudden outbreak of reported symptoms, eventually discovered that multiple prisoners were attempting to appear too ill for transport. Koch later admitted his motivation. "In America, I am a prisoner, but I eat every day. In Germany, I will be free, but my children will starve. Which would you choose?" The announcement of mandatory repatriation in January 1946 triggered what camp authorities described as a morale crisis. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, where 3,800 prisoners awaited transport, the camp newspaper Der Ruf published an anonymous essay titled "Going Home to What?" The essay, which circulated widely among camps, articulated the collective anxiety. "We have been prisoners for 2 years, 3 years, some longer. We have lived in comfort while our families suffered. We have eaten while they starved. We have been safe while they endured bombing, invasion, occupation. Now they tell us we are going home. But what is home? The letters describe a land of ruins inhabited by starving ghosts. They describe cities that no longer exist, families that have vanished, a future that holds only hunger and cold. We are told we should be joyful. We are going home. But the men are weeping because they know the truth. We are not going home. Home is gone. We are going to hell. The repatriation process itself reinforced prisoners' fears. They were transported to ports where they witnessed the devastation firsthand. At Bremerhaven, returning prisoners disembarked to find a city virtually erased by bombing. The port facilities, hastily reconstructed by American engineers, stood amid square miles of rubble. German civilians who gathered to meet returning prisoners appeared skeletal, dressed in rags, desperate for any food prisoners might have saved. Obergefreiter Franz Weber, repatriated through Bremerhaven in June 1946, described his arrival in testimony recorded by American military historians in 1951. "The ship docked and we could see the city. Or what had been a city, ruins, just ruins. The German workers at the port, they stared at us like we were from another planet. We were healthy, well-fed, our uniforms clean. They looked like concentration camp survivors. Then I understood why we had been crying in America. This was hell, real hell." The Soviet occupation zone presented horrors that exceeded even the devastation of Western Germany. Prisoners whose homes lay in the Soviet zone faced not just starvation, but systematic brutality. The Red Army treated all German males as potential war criminals. Mass arrests were common. Labor camps in the Soviet Union held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who had already been released by Western allies, only to be re-imprisoned by Soviets. Lieutenant Hoffmann, whose family lived in Saxony under Soviet occupation, never returned home. He was among approximately 3,500 German prisoners who successfully petitioned for permission to immigrate to the United States after repatriation was completed. In his immigration application, he wrote simply, "My homeland is occupied by those who will kill me. America treated me with more humanity as a prisoner than my own country can offer as a citizen. I wish to remain." Not all who wished to stay succeeded. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of prisoners. American authorities, despite sympathy for individual cases, largely enforced this requirement. The exceptions were primarily prisoners who could prove they faced political persecution, usually former anti-Nazi activists whom the Gestapo had conscripted into military service as punishment. The journey back to destroyed Germany traumatized men who thought they had already experienced war's worst. Transport ships carrying repatriated prisoners were floating hospitals, treating psychological casualties. Men who had survived combat stoically broke down completely when confronting what Germany had become. Ship doctors reported administering sedatives to dozens of prisoners who became hysterical at the sight of the German coastline. Upon arrival, prisoners faced registration, documentation and release into a society that barely functioned. The occupation authorities provided minimal support. A small amount of occupation currency, essentially worthless in the black market economy that dominated German life, a travel document to reach their home region if it still existed and was accessible. Nothing more. Prisoners released into the British and American zones faced hunger and deprivation. Those released into the Soviet zone faced potential arrest. The NKVD maintained lists of German military personnel suspected of anti-Soviet activity, a category that included virtually anyone who had fought on the Eastern Front. Thousands of repatriated prisoners were immediately re-arrested and sent to labor camps. this time as prisoners of the Soviet Union rather than the Western Allies. The contrast between American captivity and German freedom became a recurring theme in survivors' testimonies. Werner Burkhardt, whose secret diary had documented his shock at American abundance in 1943, returned to Hamburg in August 1946. His first letter to an American correspondent, Captain Morrison of Camp Ruston, arrived in October. "Dear Captain Morrison, I write to you from what was once my city. I hesitate to describe conditions as you will think I exaggerate. I do not. We live without electricity, without heat though winter approaches, without adequate food or clean water. My wife and I share a basement room with 3 other families. We are the fortunate ones. Thousands live outdoors in the ruins. I search daily for work, but there is no work. There is nothing. I think often of Louisiana. I think of the meals I complained about. I think of the warm barracks I took for granted. I think of the safety I did not appreciate. Captain, you kept me prisoner for 2 years. Those were the best 2 years of my life. This is not bitterness. It is simple truth. I was imprisoned in paradise and now I am free in hell." The emotional toll of return manifested in various ways. Some prisoners, unable to cope with the devastation, simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. They abandoned their identities, their families, their pasts, and tried to build new lives anonymously. Others found the contrast so unbearable they took their own lives. The occupation authorities never compiled comprehensive suicide statistics, but anecdotal evidence suggests significant numbers of repatriated prisoners could not survive the transition from American abundance to German desolation. Yet others discovered reserves of resilience they hadn't known they possessed. These men, having witnessed American productivity, organization, and prosperity, became architects of German reconstruction. They brought knowledge of American methods, American efficiency, American possibility. They had seen what a functioning society looked like. They understood that Germany's destruction was not permanent if Germans were willing to learn from those who had defeated them. Hans Wolff, who had wept at Camp Ruston watching the transport ships, returned to Munich to find his family living in a bombed-out apartment building. He used skills learned in an American camp woodworking shop to establish a small furniture repair business. By 1948, he employed 6 workers. By 1955, his company manufactured furniture for export. He never forgot his years as a prisoner in Louisiana. In a 1983 interview, he reflected on that April day in 1946. "I cried because I knew what was coming. I cried because I had lived so well while my family suffered so terribly. I cried because I understood that being a prisoner in America was better than being free in Germany. It was the worst moment of my life, leaving that camp. But it was also the moment I understood what Germany had to become. We had to become like America, productive, prosperous, free. That became my mission, to build a Germany that deserved the treatment America had given us, even as prisoners. The repatriation of German prisoners from American camps stands as one of history's strangest homecomings. Men leaving captivity in tears, dreading freedom, fearing home. It revealed the totality of Germany's defeat in ways military statistics could not. The prisoners had witnessed American abundance firsthand. They had lived it, eaten it, experienced it daily. They knew exactly how thoroughly Germany had been destroyed and how completely America had won. The American soldiers who supervised repatriation never forgot the sight of German prisoners weeping at the prospect of going home. Captain Morrison's final report from Camp Ruston, dated July 15, 1947, when the last prisoners departed, concluded with an observation that captured the operation's meaning. "These men are not crying because they love America," he wrote. "They are crying because they know Germany is gone. They are crying because they understand that the 2 years they spent as our prisoners were the safest, best-fed, most hopeful years they will have known since 1939. They are crying because freedom in a destroyed land is worse than captivity in a prosperous one. This is the ultimate measure of Germany's defeat. Not that we beat their armies, but that their soldiers wept when we sent them home. The prisoners who cried at American ports as ships departed for Germany were mourning more than personal comfort. They mourned the loss of hope, the death of their homeland, the transformation of Germany from a nation into a nightmare. They had lived the contrast between American abundance and German devastation. They understood in ways civilians could not that Germany had been utterly, completely, totally defeated. In the decades after the war, as Germany recovered and eventually prospered, many former prisoners returned to America as immigrants, businessmen or tourists. They visited the camps where they had been held, now abandoned or converted to other uses. They sought out the guards who had treated them fairly, the officers who had shown them humanity. They brought their children and grandchildren to see the places where, as prisoners of war, they had lived better than they ever had as free men. Camp Hearn in Texas, where Lieutenant Hoffman had kept his diary, became a historical site. In 2005, a reunion brought together former prisoners and their American guards, now all elderly men. Hoffman, who had become an American citizen in 1952 and built a successful engineering firm in Ohio, stood before the restored camp museum. A reporter asked him about the common image of prisoners celebrating release. Hoffman shook his head slowly. "That's not how it was," he said quietly. "We knew what we were going back to. We'd been reading letters for months. Starvation, destruction, death. Here we had 3 meals a day. We had medical care. We had safety. The day they told us we were going home, I saw grown men, combat veterans, weep like children, because they knew we were leaving paradise and returning to hell." The story of German prisoners crying at their homecoming reveals a profound truth about the nature of total war and total defeat. Germany had not just lost battles, it had lost everything. The prisoners who wept watching transport ships represented the visible evidence of that loss. They had seen what they were losing, the relative comfort and safety of American captivity, and what they were returning to, the absolute devastation of defeated Germany. The contrast between captivity and freedom, between America and Germany, between abundance and starvation, created a psychological crisis that marked these men for life. They had expected that return home would bring relief. Instead, it brought horror. They had expected that freedom would bring joy. Instead, it brought suffering worse than captivity. In the end, approximately 10,000 German prisoners found ways to remain in America or return after repatriation. They became American citizens, raised American families, and built American lives. When asked why they chose to stay in the country that had held them prisoner, their answers were remarkably consistent. Because, as Werner Burkhardt wrote in his memoir published in 1974, "I learned in those camps what a civilized society looks like. I learned that being a prisoner in America was better than being free in Germany. I learned that the people who defeated us were not our enemies but our teachers. They showed us, without meaning to, what Germany could become if we learned the right lessons. Some of us learned. We stayed because we understood that America had given us more as prisoners than Germany could offer as citizens. That's not betrayal. That's simple recognition of truth." The German prisoners who cried when ships left for home were crying for everything they had lost, everything Germany had lost, and everything that awaited them in the ruins of their homeland. Their tears marked the end of one Germany and the beginning of another. The prosperous, democratic Germany that would emerge from the ruins was built partly by men who had learned in American prison camps what a successful society looked like. They had been sent back to hell. Many of them spent the rest of their lives trying to transform that hell into something resembling the paradise they had briefly known behind the wire of American prison camps. Their tears at departure marked not the end of their story, but its beginning. The moment when defeated German soldiers became the architects of a new Germany, built on lessons learned in captivity from the nation that had shown them that even enemies deserve humanity.